When we're trying to handle these things on an individual basis, and there are issues that are actually happening at a national scale, a global scale, the scale is all out of wonk. And so one of the things we do see happening is there's a lot of mental and emotional well-being issues cropping up. So we see this rise of terms like compassion fatigue, or the rise of eco-anxiety as being now recognized by the American Psychological Association, the Canadian Psychological Association. These are real issues that people face when they have this sense of despair about the state of the planet and about their own well-being. We tend to absorb them and experience them as emotional and mental wellness issues. That's how they tend to play out. What becomes really important then is to be able to see what's happening at the appropriate scale, so that you can in some ways lessen that pressure on yourself of feeling like it's all sitting on your own shoulders.
If you've listened to the Hope Strategy podcast for a while, or if you're new around here, there's a good chance you've heard us mention MWI, which is Josh and I's digital marketing agency. None of the Hope Strategy podcasts would be possible without MWI. And I would like to offer a free 20-minute consultation to anybody that listens to the podcast that's looking for some digital marketing help. Just go to mwi.com/hope strategy and sign up, and we'll reach out to you, and you will get a free 20-minute consultation with yours truly to talk about your digital marketing needs, to talk about your website, whatever questions you have. I'm happy to answer them. Thank you so much for listening to the Hope Strategy podcast. Please reach out. I'd love to help you with your marketing. Welcome to a new episode of the Hope Strategy podcast. I'm Corey Blake, and I'm here with Josh Steimley. And today we spoke with Elin Kelsey, PhD. I referred to her early on as Dr. Kelsey, and she said that's fine, but she likes to go by Elin. She is an award-winning author and thought leader for evidence-based hope and environment solutions. Kelsey's work focuses on the study of the reciprocal relationship between humans and the rest of nature. Her newest book for adults, she specifies that because she's a children's book author as well. It's called Hope Matters: Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical for Solving the Environmental Crisis. It was published in October of 2020. Her influence can be seen in the hopeful solutions focus of her clients, including the Monterey Bay Aquarium and other institutions where she has served as a visiting fellow, including the Rachel Carson Center for the Environment and Society, the Rockefeller Foundation, and Stanford University in the Graduate School of Education. In spring 2022, she will serve as a Cone Foundation Fellow in Helsinki, Finland. She co-created #Ocean Optimism, a Twitter campaign to crowdsource marine conservation solutions, which has reached more than 100 million shares since it launched in 2014. Anyways, that was a really great conversation. She, again, the idea of the podcast is to talk about hope and optimism broadly. And we've talked to so many different people. I love that her whole intent is to discuss optimism and hope, and as she calls it, evidence-based hope, which I love, specifically about the environment and about, it sounds like a lot of her expertise, and based on our conversation, is specifically in the ocean and the environment. But it was fascinating. Such a smart, kind human. That was great.
Yeah, I think my favorite takeaway is that when the story is always negative, it can lead to burnout and people feeling like, well, I don't have any control over this situation, so why do anything at all? And there is so much negative news about the environment. And yet when you start looking at the positives and saying, hey, this is progressing with the whales or the polar bears or air pollution, we're reducing, when you can show those positive things, yeah, it's true that that's not all doom and gloom. And there are some people out there who all they want to show is the doom and gloom and how everything's terrible. But when you show the positive, then it gives hope that, hey, we can do something to fix this. Yeah.
And, we got into the politics of it a little bit. The fact of the matter is it doesn't, the divisiveness and the politicizing of environmentalism has caused so many strong feelings one way or the other that really aren't based on a lot of facts. It's more based in emotion. And so regardless of what your political stance is, like you told the story of growing up in LA, and we've talked about China, and we've talked about, and I lived in Hawaii and saw environmental issues firsthand. And it was cool to just get her perspective as an expert, that there is problems out there and they need fixing. And her whole approach to hope and optimism and ambition was inspiring. So really enjoyed that. One of the notes I wrote down in big letters in all caps was, how do we break that cycle? ! Question mark. And what I was referring to was that the way that all of the information, that narrative that is told constantly, which is just negative stuff sells, negative stuff gets clicks, negative stuff is what people talk about. And I'm like, eventually we've got to figure out how to break that and to flip the script to where the stuff that's getting the most clicks and the most shares and the most likes and the most whatever is the positive, uplifting, hope-filled messages that inspire and help us feel hopeful for the future. So I think that the answer to that and the way that we fix it is just the Hope Strategy podcast. We fixed it.
Exactly. For sure.
We did it. Well, that was easy. Now that I think about it, huge pat on the back. Just kidding. Okay. Well, please enjoy this conversation with Elin Kelsey.
Something is happening in our world.
Time is very precious.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
Hope in the face of difficulty.
More than machinery, we need humanity.
Hope in the face of uncertainty.
I'm better now than I was. I'm experienced now.
Changing the world can happen anywhere, and anyone can do it.
The audacity of hope.
This is the Hope Strategy Podcast with Corey Blake and Josh Steinley.
Well, it's great to meet you.
Yeah,
One of the
too.
things that I was interested in when somebody alerted me to you and what you were doing was that you have a take on things that is a little bit more peaceful than some people these days when it comes to environment. And I thought, here's somebody who actually respects both sides and is willing to talk to people as human beings rather than demonize them. And that's one of the things I really liked.
Yeah, thank you. No, I really feel that way. Yeah.
So typically where we like to start, I'm always fascinated. The armchair anthropologist in me is always really interested in where people come from and where they make their meaning, what formed them and sculpted them into the human that they became in their adult life and the work and time and energy they're putting into things. So could you start off by giving us your background a little bit, specifically like where you grew up and maybe, how where you grew up and the people you were around and the environment you were around impacted you so much that you've dedicated so much of your time and energy to this optimistic view on the environment and the work that you've done?
Sure. Well, that's such a nice question to ask somebody about who they are, So I grew up in a suburb of Toronto. And it was a developing suburb in the sense that, lots of new builds going in and that sort of thing. And I think from a really early age, as a little kid, I was just crazy for nature. And I was quite lucky that in this landscape of rapidly developing houses and things, there was a ravine behind our house, which had a creek running through it. And as a little child, I had a lot of freedom to wander in that area. I had a dog. We'd walk, I was always trying to get as far as I could possibly get. That was my goal, sort of walk as far as I could get, to ride my bike as far as I could go, and to see things. And, so even in this intensely urban, suburban environment, I saw so much life. There was muskrats down there. There were snakes. There were lots of animals to observe. And I think even in that kind of environment, I was just really aware of how much I love nature, and I just really wanted to be part of it. And I was adventurous. I always wanted to see new things.
Did you have siblings or like friends that you roamed with and explored, or was a lot of that just your own natural interest and you going off and exploring on your own?
I did a lot of that on my own with my dog. I have siblings, I have sisters, and I had friends, and I'm an intensely social person. I've really learned that through the pandemic. I think I knew it, but now I really know it.
Yeah.
I love people and I love other species. And I think that that's been true my whole life. And then I was very lucky in university. I happened to go to a university that had a nature interpretation program, which was very new. I'm now in my late 50s. And so in the early 80s, that was a kind of a new idea that there would be this sort of communication focus on the environment, which up until that point wasn't really there so much.
Yeah. What is nature interpretation? I mean, it broadly. Defined.
Yeah, it's really this idea of how we connect people in their ordinary lives with the greater than human world, So you might talk about, classic ways would be taking kindergartners snowshoeing or something like that.
Okay.
And that's really emerged into a massive field over the last decades that looks at how we communicate science in museums and aquariums and those sorts of places, national parks, all of these kinds of places where people are immersed with other species. And I was just lucky that I happened to go into a university that had that kind of emphasis at a very early time. And then from there, I worked in a lot of zoos and aquariums and museums and the kinds of places that do engage the public. And one of the things I found there is that there was this narrative of sort of the ignorant public, that our whole job was to take expert knowledge and share it with people who didn't know anything. And what really struck me about that narrative is just, it seemed really wrong. It was very, very common. And I worked in different countries and I worked in different institutions, but that narrative was consistent. And so I suppose from a early age, I started to be quite aware of narratives and how they become taken for granted truths and how they just get reproduced over and over and over again. And the reason I thought it was wrong is that in my everyday life, I'd meet all kinds of people who were very informed about things, very concerned about things, but then we'd go back into our work environment and act as if people weren't, And since then, there's been a lot of research that shows, if you fall ill or someone you love falls ill, you become a very good consumer of very up-to-date information about that illness because you're very motivated. And so that got me thinking a lot more about how do we really engage authentically with issues that matter. And that, I suppose, took me into, I happen to also be a children's book writer. And so I was doing lots of work. I'd end up in schools as a visiting author. And while I was there, I'd find that there were kids, just so keen about the world in grade 2 and grade 1. And yet at the same time as I was there as an environmental writer, someone would invite a scientist along and that scientist might be saying to those kids, this much of the Amazon has been destroyed in the time we've been in your class, or these really heavy-handed kinds of statements that were crushing to those little kids. And so that really made me think a lot about what's the role of emotions in this whole question of engagement and the way that we interact with the important issues of our time, like conservation and climate change and all of those things. And why are we so focused on what we think and not about how we feel?
I love that. I'm excited to get into all that. I'm going to say for all of the listeners, so right off the top of the episode, when we were first talking, Ellen said, I like to do my work outside. She's coming to us from, it looks like a sunroom, I'm guessing, kind of in the back.
Actually, I'm outside. I'm just underneath a covered porch. Yeah.
Okay. And I love that your childhood stories of exploring the backyard and being with animals and being with nature is still to this day. We've got ducks walking in the background and we've seen some animals, and then you'll hear normally in the episode, it's like, hey, let's edit out any of the extra noise. But in this episode, we're going to leave the ducks quacking and because it's your authentic self. I absolutely love it. It goes in perfectly with everything I've read and what we're hearing. So what's your education then? So you obviously had this passion for all of this as a child, and then how did that transition into what you decided to study and what you went on to do educationally?
Yeah. So I ended up, I did an undergraduate in zoology, and then I went on to work in, as I said, zoos and aquariums and places like that. And around that time, I'd been working for a few years. I noticed that this whole emerging field of visitor studies. So how do we study the people who come to those kind of places and what matters to them? And again, always from this question for me about how do we engage people with these important issues, that matter a ton. And so I went back and did a master's while I was working full time in it was in science learning in informal settings, like those kind of places. And then I worked at a national museum and did that sort of thing. I did a lot of contracting with the UN and other kinds of organizations, always in this realm of engagement, communications. And then I went back and did a PhD, and I did it in international environmental policy, because at that time, the Biodiversity Convention and the Climate Change Convention were both being formed. And what was really dramatic about that was, up until then, most of the major environmental agreements we have on Earth were like maybe 2 countries talking about water rights or, really smaller things. But what those 2 conventions was 192 countries coming together around global issues. And I thought, if I'm interested in how we engage, I need to be understanding that policy world in a way that I I didn't before. And so I made a choice to do my PhD in England because I knew a lot of that work was occurring in the EU and in the UK. And I wanted more of a global perspective because by then I was living in Canada and the United States. And so I wanted to have a different, more of an international worldview. So that was great. And so my subspecialty within that was environmental communications. And I've continued on now to work. I work primarily looking at these big global issues and how we engage as little kids or as, any of us in our ordinary lives. That's what really fascinates me.
So so you're a children's book author. How many books have you authored as a children's book
Yeah, I think about
author?
20. Yeah.
Okay. When did that start? Did that start when you were younger and you were in school and stuff? You started doing that? Or is that something you came across later once you kind of had already established your career and stuff and you wanted to do something extra?
Yeah.
How did that all come to be?
Actually, it's a great example of why being a volunteer is a good thing. So when I was in high school, I was working part-time at jobs that I didn't enjoy that much. I was like cutting onions and cleaning bathrooms at Wendy's, those kinds of jobs that all of us have had, I'm sure. But I happened to be working at a place that was quite close to the Toronto Zoo. And the Toronto Zoo was just starting. Again, I'm, of a certain age. And I went to the zoo on one of my lunch hours and I saw there was a door that said education. I'd never thought about education in zoos. I just hadn't thought. Now, of course, that's a big part of what zoos do. But at that time, it was a new idea. So I knocked on that door. And the woman there, we had a great talk. She said, why don't you do some volunteering for us? And because I was heading off to university in another place, the only way I could volunteer was by writing for them. And so I did a lot of writing for them. And so a year or two later, when I was still in university, they approached me and said, a publisher has come to us. They want to do a series of books about animals. We think you write really well. Would you be interested? And so that's a pretty lucky introduction into publication. And so I did those books. It's really funny because they still exist in libraries all over the world. Books I wrote on beavers and things like that, as a very young person. But that then gave me, in publishing, it really helps to have been published. So it then allowed me to I did work as I still work very much doing freelance writing for magazines and I write for newspapers. I do lots of kinds of writing. But then I moved more and continue to move. I'm very interested in how we portray animals and really current up-to-date science for kids and for adults. Because I think a lot of times when we're talking about the world, part of what contributes to this doom and gloom message is that we make assumptions. We think, okay, whales were endangered, so they must always be endangered. Or, this is a problem, so it must always be a problem. And in my writing, I always do interviews first person with scientists so I can have the most current information so that I can share, for example, that humpback whales, for example, in most parts of the world, all but 2 populations are recovering really well. And that's an important thing to know. That's an outcome of ending commercial whaling. That's an outcome of increasing marine protected areas. That's an outcome of a lot of things. And so if we don't know that things change, we can stay really stuck in narratives that are actually inaccurate. And it doesn't diminish the fact that we need to be doing lots of work around ocean conservation in that case. But it means that we have a clearer idea of where we're at and which things work well so that we can amplify those things.
Yeah, if you feel like everything you're doing isn't working and no matter what you do, it doesn't make any difference, it makes you stop trying.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's very disempowering and demotivating. And there's, in just recent years, many more research studies that show that very thing. So a friend of mine at Lakehead University in Canada, she just did a national study of kids across Canada between grade 7 and grade 12. And what she found is that those kids were really aware of climate change. They were really concerned about climate change. And 46% of them, so a national representative survey, believe there's nothing that can be done about it. And so that's a hugely important issue. This issue of engagement and feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, disengagement is, to my mind, a crucial conservation issue. And so that's what drives my work around evidence-based hope.
So I think the biggest question with this on this specific topic, and we'll touch on a few that are similar to this, but why? Why do you feel, and all the research you've done, I mean, I think I know some of the answers, but based on, your expertise,
Yeah.
why, for example, things like global warming are so politicized that you only ever hear those terrible facts because people are trying, it seems, to instill some sort of fear. It's a fear-based approach to change, which from what I understand as a parent, if nothing else, and as a leader of teams, typically doesn't work that well. It may work a little bit with certain people, but it's this fear-based. And so when you're on the news or you're reading a magazine or you're on social media and all you're hearing, like you said, is those, and I remember those stories as a kid where they say, you know, in the last hour, you know, 10 acres of the Amazon forest has been destroyed. And that's it's like, I'm terrified. And you're right. Like Josh said, that makes you feel like, well, I guess there's nothing I can do to help this. It sounds like it's pretty far out of hand already. Yeah. Why is that the narrative that's so, from all of the, you know, places where we get most of our information, why is that the narrative that seems to be spread? What's the purpose of that?
Yeah. Oh, well, it's such a good question, and it's a complicated question in a way, because I think there's a lot of factors that contribute to it. So you're absolutely right. The number one way that most of us hear about the environment is through the media. And we're now in a media cycle, which is 24/7. You know, we get media in our personal devices. We sleep with our phones, you know, so we're really inundated by the media all the time in a way that it's really escalated. And on top of that, problems are deemed to be more newsworthy than solutions. So we have a certain norm within our journalistic structure that tends to prioritize problems. And then within the environmental realm of that journalism, because these issues are global and urgent and they need our attention, there has been this real sort of underlying assumption that if people just knew better, they would act better. And so fear and shame have been the dominant ways that we've tried to make people know better. You know, it's sort of that, let's yell as loud as we can. But I think what's missing from all of that is that over time, things really have shifted, you know. And so if you follow, like Pew, for example, does a regular updates on knowledge and attitudes around climate change, and you can look at the US or other countries. And what we see is that people's knowledge has really increased and their concern has really increased. And what we know from the psychological literature is if you just keep hammering people with problems when they already know it's a problem, then they'll do all kinds of coping mechanisms, shut down, tune out, give up, you know, all of those kinds of things happen. So we're actually sort of actively creating a situation in which we're disengaging people from the very things we want to engage them with.
Yeah. And I heard you say in another interview, just going before I missed that point, not only does it make them disengage, but it also causes them to, one of the things you had mentioned is like go out and shop. Like people will cope in certain ways, and they'll actually, and not just say, I guess there's nothing I can do about it, but they'll actually go out and actively go shopping or go, you know, become bigger consumers or go to McDonald's and eat a bunch of, you know, food to stress eat, whatever it might be, things that are actually hurting the environment even more. And so there's this trend of like, they're disengaging, but then also they're doing things to manage their stress that are actually not good for the environment as well.
Yeah, that comes from a piece of psychology called terror management theory. And what terror management theory says is that we're really concerned. We have existential concerns about our lives and our own safety. You know, I think we all have experienced lots of that during this COVID time. And so sometimes, especially when we live in a consumerist society where that's kind of the norm, the acquisition of things is a way that we know that we're okay in a way, you know, even though that's not where we want to be environmentally, but it is where we have been in this capitalist society. And so, yes, it can be one of the things we do. We sort of self-soothe by over-consuming because we're so concerned about a problem that over-consuming actually negatively impacts. So, and
the pandemic's a great example of that. It's a great example of, look at how Amazon stock has gone up in the last year through a pandemic, right? And look at online set. We're a digital marketing agency. We have a lot of e-commerce clients that have had their best years ever because people were stuck at home on their phones, getting targeted with ads, with things that they thought they needed or wanted or whatever. And they just had more time on their hands. So again, that's obviously the reason was the pandemic, not anything environmental specifically. But
I think one of the things too that has changed, you know, you were talking about climate change being so politicized, and absolutely that's the case. But I think a really interesting indication of how it's shifted into being, in fact, an idea that people are coming together around is the fact that, one of the first moves of President Biden was to rejoin the climate accord. And he's a person who's very focused right now on trying to bring together polarized differences, right? So climate change has shifted dramatically in the United States from being a very polarized issue to be an issue that's of high concern across many different political lines. And especially we see this amongst youth. And, 42% of the world is now 25 years of age or younger. And when you look across that age group in the United States, as well as other countries, the dominant things those youth are interested in is climate change and social justice. So we see that through Black Lives Matter. We see that through marches for equity. We see that through the 2019 climate change marches, that this whole idea is actually a very unifying force of youth who are demanding, transformations in the world. They're not interested in sustainability anymore. It's about transformation.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. And that's an interesting, so you said 46% of the world is 25 years old or younger.
I think it's 42%.
42%.
I could check it for you.
No.
Yeah.
We'll check it.
And I think it's, more than half of the world is 30 or younger.
Yeah. So we live in a young 30, world. 40 years is going to be interesting with these Gen Zers and millennials, coming into these positions of power and leadership. And it'll be, it's going to be fascinating.
And one of the things that's been really intriguing to me is that the climate change marches, which happened in 2019, by the beginning of 2020, 1 in 10 people on Earth now live in a place that has declared a climate emergency. That's a tremendous outcome of those massive movements. And many people fear that climate change kind of disappeared because during COVID, we've had what they call a media eclipse, right? Where COVID news sort of dominates and other news in the US has dominated, and we don't hear much about climate change. But in fact, climate change action and engagement has stayed steady and, if anything, grown during the pandemic. And we see in lots of surveys, people's concern about the climate has increased as their concern about COVID has happened. So really recognizing ties between personal health and environmental health and those kinds of things. So again, staying up to date with things as they're shifting is just a critical part of evidence-based hope, because our assumptions are often not borne out by our evidence. Yeah, our assumptions that people don't care. Yeah.
Just so you know, when I look down, I'm taking notes to make sure I don't miss things. I'm not writing a letter.
My mind is jumping between, was it 42% or 46%?
I want to come back. What I was writing down here is I want to talk about some of the biggest challenges environmentally. And then, and again, that's kind of the typical narrative. It's like, well, I want to talk about that, but then I also want to talk about the biggest hopes that we're seeing from those and the biggest optimisms. But before that, you said something before which struck me. Is that when people learn, you mentioned a parent gets sick or a loved one gets sick or a friend or whatever, people tend to dive into the information to really gain an understanding of that thing so that they can be a resource and a help and a support. One of the things I said to my wife early in 2020 with the pandemic was that we were being inundated with so much information so fast that most of us don't have a biology degree or an expertise in viral whatever and pandemics and all this stuff, right? And it was just like within a week, it was like, oh my goodness, we've taken in more information on this subject than probably our grandparents took in their entire lives in 1 week, given all of the different mediums that we're taking in information from. So the amount of information that we've been forced to take in, the amount of care that people have now and all of these different things, I mean, what effect has that had on society, on culture, and how do you see that affecting maybe the future of the way that we take in this type of information and make changes as a result?
Yeah, I think the experience you're describing is a really common one. I think we all feel that at the same time. I think what it points to for me is that when we're trying to handle these things on an individual basis, and there are issues that are actually happening at a national scale, a global scale, the scale is all out of wonk. And so one of the things we do see happening is there's a lot of mental and emotional well-being issues cropping up. So we see this rise of terms like compassion fatigue, or the rise of eco-anxiety as being now recognized by the American Psychological Association, the Canadian Psychological Association. These are real issues that people face when they have this sense of despair about the state of the planet and about their own well-being. And the same thing is, of course, exacerbated by the pandemic, where fears about personal health, friends' health, our society operating in very different ways. And so we tend to absorb them and experience them as emotional and mental wellness issues. That's how they tend to play out. And I think one of the makes me think of a number of things. What becomes really important then is to be able to see what's happening at the appropriate scale, so that you can in some ways lessen that pressure on yourself of feeling like it's all sitting on your own shoulders, and I think that's why children in classrooms being told the Amazon is wrecked is just such a wrong scaled thing. What is that child really going to do? We don't ask kids to walk into the operating room and say, hey, what do we do about this liver? And it's acting as if there's no expertise. And so one response to that is that I think it's really, really valuable to look at things like there's now, because of big data, we can look at big data sets in ways we never could before. And so projects like Project Drawdown, which is this attempt to say, okay, if we look across all the evidence of the kinds of things we can do for climate change, in this case, what's the number one biggest impact we can have? And then who's working in that area? So it may surprise people to know that the number one thing Project Drawdown sees is refrigerants, so the kinds of chemicals we use in air conditioning and fridges and all these kind of things. So you may think on the surface, okay, what does that have to do with me? Well, I think it's really helpful to know that the same international organization that has been really effective at resolving the ozone hole problem, that we knew about decades ago, which has almost been resolved, is the same international body tackling refrigerants now and has been for a number of years. So when you know that at a scale that you probably never have to touch, these kinds of international bodies we put together do matter. I think that's why it's exciting to see the US rejoining the climate change agreement. These kinds of things, we don't see them in our ordinary life, but they do matter, and they do need to work at those kind of scales. And then on the whole opposite side, I think what's really been exciting to me to observe in the climate change marches and other youth social justice oriented things is a real focus on community care and self-kindness and self-care. And so recognizing that the way we stay resilient against these really difficult problems is to, understand how they're changing and engage in that, but also to really take care of ourselves and each other. And I think that I see that sort of allyship ideas, these are the sorts of values that you'll see when you go to those movements. One of the defining features of the climate change movement is a real mixing of joy and anger, or, arts expression, singing. You may know of the Sunrise Movement, which is youth who sing to demand the political changes they want to see. So this real mashup of expressive, creative ways of saying who we are as whole people. And at a lot of those kinds of, in those movements, a lot of care for younger children by older children, so really recognizing, hey, I can't do this thing now because I'm at home and I'm in lockdown, but I can do this thing to support that, or to support the person who's doing that thing. So I see that this value on self-care and on community care and on taking care of each other, which I think in some ways can be positively reinforced through the pandemic. I know in British Columbia right now, the big slogan is, be kind, be safe. That kindness has been a priority. And now there are, in fact, whole university research labs on kindness, because we see that things like trust and kindness and compassion are not frivolous, isn't that nice? They're actually core ways that we engage in societies and in the kinds of changes we need to make. It's how we stay resilient.
I remember a bit of a paradigm shift that I had, again, not somebody who studied environmentalism very much. I'm just I've been more of somebody who's taken it in and studied it a little bit and done my best. I lived in Hawaii for 8 years off and on. Yeah. And obviously there it's much more top of mind, for like single-use plastics. I think it was 3 years ago or something that they eliminated plastic bags completely. They don't do plastic bags anymore. All restaurants, it was, I think by law, it was, they didn't have plastic straws anymore. Yeah. And so it just naturally living there, it became much more top of mind as somebody who's originally from well, I grew up in the military, but had lived in Utah and a lot of, states that weren't as concerned about that, so it became more top of mind, and I thought about it a lot more, and had a lot of friends and people around me that were much more conscious, especially when you live on a little island and you're like, this is all we got. Like, we got to take care of this place, because it's very apparent if it's not being taken care of in a way that maybe you don't notice when you live in a big metropolitan area or something, but like if you go to the beach and there's trash everywhere, it came from somewhere and somebody didn't, so it's a little more in your face. But while I was there, and what I was getting at, and sometimes I ramble, as people know, but
as do I. That's right.
I was going, we went to Maui, and I was teaching at a university there as an entrepreneur in residence. And we took a group of students to Maui to do the great whale count, to where we counted for like a day and a half, just counted humpback whales. Wow. And we went out on a boat and we followed right along with them. And I remember thinking, man, my whole life I've heard about how these are endangered and dying, and the whales and the whales and the whales and the whales, and save the whales. And it was just like, that's just the narrative in my head. Yeah. And I sat on the beach one day and counted over 100 whales and saw hundreds of baby whales over a few days, and calves, I guess, as they're called. And so I remember just like being there and participating in it and seeing it, and also hearing the optimism of the people that were running these programs and stuff. It was like, hey, we're doing something good here, Yes. So what's your experience in engaging people, or in offering your time, or service or volunteerism, and the effect that can have on somebody's overall optimism, hope, and ambition for the environment in this case?
Yeah. And I think, it's absolutely true that engaging in real things, and in fact, we know millennials, for example, the way they like to engage with the environment and social change is in real world examples, often within places that they live. Rather than joining a large organization, they want to work on project by project on things that matter to them at that moment. So maybe if they have young kids, it's tied to, how those young kids are engaging in community gardens or something else. And then that issue might switch again, So I think in some ways we have a gig economy way of engaging with the issues that matter to us. And I think that's important and good. Those things matter. I also think that kind of just recognizing, like when you were out there with those whales, it's just so helpful to see how like incongruous the message you were hearing in your mind, that narrative that was timeless in a way, you've been, was out of sync with what you were actually seeing. And I think one of the amazing things that's happened in a lot of ways that people engage now is that we're in this period of digital conservation. So, people can follow humpbacks that have tags on them, or sharks, for example. It's been a very positive impact on white sharks. The fact that researchers tag them to see what areas of the ocean matter most to them. And people now at home in lockdown can follow those white sharks and see where they actually go. And then you start to realize, wow, those white sharks have really, specific migratory patterns, like some of those humpbacks. And you start to see which areas really matter to them. So then when you are engaged in picking up plastic on a beach or whatever, it's not like, what does this one piece matter to anything? It feels a lot different when 171 countries have now put in some form of legislation or bans or tariffs on single-use plastic bags. And, these whales really depend on this area. We know this because they come back here every year in this way. So the specificity of it all, I think, and the volunteering, we're wanting more specific volunteering where we can see the results, and we have insights in specific ways that we just really didn't even have 10 years ago. And so I think that's been part of the movement to establish marine protected areas, for example, has really been helped by this large conservation digitalization, because now you can say this part of the ocean for all these different species really matters. And so let's put our emphasis there.
Could you even have fathomed some of this technology that they're using now? I mean, when you were studying and getting your PhD and stuff, like it's insane. I've tracked that. Obviously that whale counting that we did, but then also living in Hawaii and surfing and stuff there, we did look at the shark. I always was curious, where are the sharks right now?
Yes, of course you are. Yeah.
Let's see where they're hanging out. And so I would look at those websites and see Or if there was whenever you heard about a shark attack or something, or a shark was seen at this beach we'd go to, we'd always go look and kind of see where they're hanging out. And it was always fascinating to understand, they're just out there living. And sometimes they come in for food when it's there. And when the river broke through and there was a lot more chum in the water right there, then you might want to not be in the water, because it shows that here they come, right? Like,
exactly. Creates a more respectful relationship, right?
Sure.
Because you can just really know, okay, today's not the best day. Maybe tomorrow's an okay day, rather than this is always bad or this is always okay.
Yeah. What type of entrepreneurial endeavors or initiatives have you seen come from this environmentalism, going kind of back to the technologies and stuff that we're using? We're also seeing a lot of amazing tools and softwares and initiatives and nonprofits and NGOs and stuff that are coming from these millennials and Gen Zers that are passionate about these things we're talking about, that it's on their radar, but they're also, entrepreneurship is booming and it's something that everybody's interested in, it seems, at this point. Have you seen any specific causes or any specific trends or something that have been fascinating to you to watch?
Yeah, I'm really interested, for example, in food waste, because again, Project Drawdown, I think it's number 3 or number 4, like when you look across all the things, food waste is a huge one. It's getting on top of that has a big, big impact for climate change. And it obviously has a big impact in terms of poverty and hunger and, really important social issues.
Yeah, I'll give a big shout out right now, actually, to Gooder, who's one of MWI, our marketing agency's newest clients. Gooder, we're managing all of their paid advertising as they expand, but that's exactly what they do. They started in, I think, Georgia. Entrepreneur saw the opportunity to go to all of these big convention centers and restaurants and hotels that were throwing away so much food at the end of the day, and said, how can we systematize this? And how can we use technology in order to, go and pick all this food up and take it to either to homeless shelters or to compost it or whatever, I'm not sure all the details, but anyways, big shout out to Gooder. They're doing amazing things. And
I'm so glad you said that. And I think, they are within this whole ecosystem, essentially, of these sorts of personalized apps and other digital forms that allow us to not waste so much. And so there's all kinds of, and we see more smart technology in refrigerators, for example, that can tell people what food is in there and how quickly it's going bad and all that sort of thing. And even hospitals now taking on, allowing people in the hospital to make choices about what food they want, in addition to what's, sort of on their sheet for what they can have. And they've substantially reduced food waste in that way. And then we see technologies and around, I think it's in Korea, Seoul, Korea, it's over 90% of food waste is taken to receptacles in this and used, and then used as biofuel on top of that, which is a major use within that city. So I think, we see these examples, and then we see movements happening in grocery stores. So in Finland, they have a happy hour for some of their grocery stores, so that, at the end of the day, they're going to be letting certain foods go at very cheap prices. And there's apps to let you know what those foods are, so you're not wasting your time going if it's not something that you want. And in France, they've brought in laws to actually make it illegal for stores of a certain size to not donate their food. They have to do donations. And just in this last year, now that applies to other goods. So they have to donate things other than food for other kinds of large stores. So I think we see this capacity to give us real-time feedback has created all these entrepreneurial opportunities that create savings for us as individuals, but also in terms of waste and other kinds of things. So to me, that's a really growing and important area.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of it. I taught social entrepreneurship classes out there at that university, and seeing the programs and stuff that young entrepreneurs are coming up with in ways to sustain, and take care of the environment or provide opportunities.
And part of that's part of this justice interest too, right? Around sharing and making sure that things are more equitably distributed. That's part of the moral obligation.
Yeah,
and that also can have.
There probably wouldn't have been much demand for that 20 years ago, that class, right? That type of social entrepreneur class, there probably would have been what does that mean? But now it's so much on the forefront of people's minds. It's awesome to see. It's definitely empowering to see all of the changes that are being made.
Yeah. And this expectation now, I would say, of corporations to be socially responsible went from being an idea we were advocating for to now an essential business practice. Like it's really shifted in terms of just an expectation being played out in terms of values. I'd say one of the other big things that where we're seeing a lot of it is around transparency and traceability, right? So we know that we are now demanding to see where dollars go, shareholders, investors are demanding of organizations that they decarbonize, these sorts of initiatives that we see. And then that creates new economic opportunities as those demands are there. So I think we're in a real period of shift.
Yeah.
Really big period.
It seems like it. What would you say? Because I know there's still people out there that maybe because of some of the things that we've said, maybe because they've just heard the negatives for their whole life, they think, oh, there's nothing I can do about this. Or there's even still people out there that say that's not a problem, for whatever reason, if it's political or other, that's not actually a problem that exists in the world. It's made up. There's a big spectrum of what, people that might just not understand it. So they choose to say, probably whatever, to those that are obviously staunch, that doesn't exist. What using your expertise and experience here to help others, what would you say to those individuals to help them understand the problem at hand and the opportunities and the hope in the whole process?
I think the number one thing I try to do is when somebody expresses something to me, I really try to listen to them. And by listening, I think you usually can pretty quickly get a sense of how they're feeling. And often underneath what they're saying are feelings of worry or concern or fear or cynicism or, we know that cynicism, for example, is on the rise in many countries around the world. Distrust, it makes sense that we feel all these things. We're in vulnerable periods of time where things feel very untrustworthy, And so by listening and hearing how someone feels, then you have a much clearer idea where they're coming from and what they care about. I would say one of the funniest, not funny, but noteworthy things is that I've been talking about evidence-based hope and solutions for probably almost a couple of decades now. And the number one thing people usually tell me is the worst example they can think of, Yeah. And I think I think that's coming from a place that people are concerned perhaps that I don't know that there's a problem. And so I just really, it's kind of a rough thing because I have to hear about a lot of terrible things all the time. Yeah. But I think it's an important thing because by doing that, it shows me that they care about something, they really care about it. That's why they're telling me. And so if I can listen from that place of care, then we can get into a deeper conversation, as you're saying, based on some kind of common value or common empathy, even common compassion. And then you're much more able to think about things like even these idea shifts. So climate denial used to be the thing we were really concerned about. I think Michael Mann and other academics have helped us to see that the bigger issue now is climate doomism, a sense of fatalism, like those students I talked about early in the interview, is that if you really are fatalistic and think the world is wrecked, then it's also politically advantageous for those who would choose not to act. Because if something's truly wrecked, there is no point in acting. And so I see that the choice around evidence-based hope is a political choice, because otherwise we are making a political choice around fatalism or doom, which then puts us down a dead-end place where no action is required because it's pointless. And so I think it's interesting to now think about climate doom as a political advantageous stance for those who would choose inaction. Sorry, my dog is joining in at the moment.
It's okay. I'm soaking it in. I want people to really feel like they're sitting out there on your porch with you.
Thank you.
So I grew up in a home where it was very conservative. We listened to Rush Limbaugh growing up, and Rush Limbaugh is not exactly a friend of liberal environmentalists.
Yep.
And the story that I absorbed growing up politically was that there are people on the left who want to use environmentalism, not really to help the environment, but as a political tool to acquire power and to control the economy, to control people. And so there's a lot of fear in a large swath of the citizens, at least in the United States, that environmentalism is just kind of it's the story to get power and control over other people, but it's not really about the environment. And then, of course, you do have people who care legitimately about the environment. Mm-hmm. But even growing up in this household, I grew up in Los Angeles. And when I was a kid, the smog, the air pollution was just terrible. It was so bad. There were days where I would walk out of my house and look up the street and I could not see the end of the street because the pollution was so bad. Yeah. And so I grew up with that. And then my dad was a beekeeper, and we've watched in recent years that there's this, I can't remember the name of it, but the bees basically are dying and disappearing. And so I come to environmental matters and I say, I know there are problems out there because I've seen it. You see it firsthand. You can see the air pollution. You can see the bees disappearing. You lived in China. Yeah, and I lived in China too. And right. You want to talk about environmental problems, it's off the charts in terms of pollution there and what's going on with the oceans and everything over there. And so I see problems firsthand. And then there's all this political rhetoric on both sides, each side accusing the other of either hating the environment or not caring or having ulterior motives. And it seems like it's hard to cut through the noise and figure out where are the problems that we can actually all get behind and all make progress on. And yet it's got to be there. It seems like there is room to say, here's a problem that nobody disagrees on. We all agree this is an issue. How can we come together and make this work for everybody? The people who are afraid of politicians taking control, as well as the environmentalists on the left, right, conservative, liberal. What are some of those issues where there's the largest opportunity to bring everybody together and say, here's something that we can all agree on and make progress on?
Thinking of a couple of things. One is I'm thinking right away about clean air and this whole recognition of health issues, right? So I think one thing that's really transitioned in the last few decades is this idea of health as not, of course, our individual behavior affects our health, absolutely. But this whole emergence of the social determinants of health, right? We know that our health is really determined by where we live in a city. Our lifespan there are all these interesting infographics now that show us, right? If we live on one part of a subway system in New York City, we will be 10 years higher lifespan than if we live in another part of the city, and that's because of access to healthcare, access to clean air, access to good food, So we now see that our health, and by extension, the broader environment has huge implications on us. So I think focus on health as being a whole social issue is making a big difference in terms of how people relate to environmental issues, because there's huge environmental justice issues around health, right? And we've talked a lot about that during the pandemic. We really see that case, very inequitable chances of getting the pandemic, right, as a result of where we happen to live. So I think health is one of these great unifiers that we see beyond our individual, taking care of our individual self, but as a collective need. And interestingly enough, I think climate change has become a great unifier. And if you look at the number of even in the United States, when former President Trump removed the U.S. from the climate change agreement, there was this counter movement of industries, corporations, individuals, not-for-profits called We Are Still In that continued on. And these are some of the biggest money companies in the United States who see that climate change is just a core issue that they're already acting on. And so I think we can get caught on what looks like a surface politics disagreement, but which is rapidly changing. And I just saw recently, the number of young Republicans, for example, who are very, very committed to climate change is now in the high 70%. So all of these sort of issues that we see as divided and stuck are rapidly shifting. And that's why we need to keep track of what is happening so we can position our feelings and say, oh, am I feeling something that I've carried since I was a young person, which of course is the truth of my childhood and my upbringing. And where is it calibrating now around how people are feeling and where divisions sit or don't divide. So I think that's why it's so important. And when I think about air pollution, one of the big drivers of positive changes around air pollution in China has been these handheld apps, right? Where we are able to see what's the air quality this morning can I ride my bike? Do I have to wear a mask? Of course, we're all wearing masks now, but you know what I mean, for our own personal health. And then seeing how bad the pollution is and demanding change because we have that actual, number sitting in front of us on a daily basis that gives us anger. And we know that both hope and anger are very activating emotions. It's not that we stay hopeful and happy and think nothing's wrong. Hope is one very activating emotion that is important to hold on to, as is anger around injustice or around things that are broken that need to be changed.
Yeah, I think one of the big changes, Josh, kind of going off what you said is, and what you've mentioned multiple times, Ellen, is that the amount of data and information that we have now paints such a more clear picture. Because Josh, maybe even when you were growing up in LA, it was politicized and you didn't have much information other than they said this and they said this. And, this one person said this and this one person said this, and it was hard to judge. But now, when you just when you do research and you look at actual, or like you said, these apps that show you, or like you pull out your phone and it says the air quality is here. It's an in your face reminder every day. Like the air quality isn't good and my lungs are feeling it. When I lived in Utah, every year there's an inversion up in northern Utah where the smog just gets trapped in the valley there. And my sinuses were terrible for 4 months. Everybody's always sick. It's just like very clear that there's a problem. And so, you used to be able to write a lot of that information off. And now there's and that's why I think you see 70+% of young Republicans who may, for economic purposes or other, lean one way, say, oh no, we can't really, I'm not dumb. I can see this now at this point, and I can understand that this is an actual problem, and that's good, right? There's obviously, hopefully, where you're getting that information from is very important, and there's a lot of different ways to take in that information. But if you do your research and look at a lot of balanced sources, you can usually draw some pretty clear conclusions.
And so I think also, the wildfires, we are now physically experiencing the impacts of climate change in a way that is really problematic. And so I think it's also on a felt personal basis that people are recognizing and coming together around these issues. Yeah.
So given your experience in evidence-based hope, and again, so the book is, let's see here, Hope Matters: Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical for Solving the Environmental Crisis. What are again, with this idea of evidence-based hope, what are the biggest problems right now? And what are the biggest hopeful solutions that you have? Maybe one or two, the biggest environmental problems that we're facing that we can impact. And then some of those hopeful evidence-based strategies that we can put into place in order to help as individuals and in our communities, and obviously global citizens as well.
Yeah.
Another big question.
Yeah, exactly. I'm feeling my small mind. We certainly recognize inequity as a core issue facing the planet, and one of the completely tied to that is climate change. That's why youth activists are asking for climate justice. They're talking about climate change very disproportionately impacts different people, in different parts of the world. And so climate change and the inequities that are supporting it and that are the outcomes of it is a huge issue. And then biodiversity loss, so the loss of other species, extinction rates, and degradation of marine and land-based environments. So those are two huge issues that then end up causing, and of course pollution and all of those kinds of things that come together in terms of loss of habitat, right? Degradation of habitat. And then on the opposite side, I think one of the really, hopeful things that we're seeing is that at an international level, there's been this real recognition that we really need to really look at that broader ecosystem. So tackling climate change and tackling biodiversity loss are finally now coming together and seeing that we need that they both go together in really important ways. So we were talking about whales, humpback whales in Hawaii. Recent work being done to show that as whale populations of different species have been increasing, and of course we still have endangered whales, we still have endangered populations and threatened populations, but as many different kinds of whales are increasing again, that the carbon capture of a single whale is estimated at over $2 million, because as whales move through the ocean, they move phytoplankton up to the surface. And those are the tiny plants, that float in the top of the water. Those are 40% of greenhouse gases are absorbed by phytoplankton. And so the increase and care around marine protected areas has a big positive impact on climate change because of its impact on whales and healthier ecosystems. And we are seeing President Biden, for example, just made a dedication of conserving 25% of land and water by 2025, 30% by 2030. He's not alone in that. 71 countries have agreed to that in this last year. That's a really huge move. And part of the way of getting there is through ecological restoration. So taking areas that are hugely damaged and restoring them. And cities are, in many cases, looking at the restoration of wetlands to deal with flooding or these sorts of things. So we're seeing how important it is to set these high goals. And what I think is exciting about this 2025 and 2030 is that that's coming out of this mass scientific movement, which was saying nature needs half. We really need half the planet to be really vibrantly healthy for other species. And so then we see that, of course, gets watered down and we're now at 30% or 25%. But when you think where we're at in the early 2020, at the turn of I can't think of the right word for it, when we came into the 2000s, right? There was almost no marine protected areas whatsoever. And in 2009, I worked on a project former President Bush dedicated as his final act of leaving office to designate the world's largest marine protected area. That was thrilling. He actually did it. But what's important about that, so that's 2008, 2009, somewhere in there. Now that is, I think, the 14th largest marine protected area. We're seeing these large ecosystem scale protected areas coming to place. Now, of course, we have to push to make sure they're fully protected and they don't have other issues. And are they properly surveyed? And, I'm not in any way saying problems go away. But what I'm saying is there's positive trends, and then it helps us to really be more vigilant because we can see things moving in the directions that we need them to move in and we need to amplify. And now, because marine protected areas have been in place for over a decade or more, we're starting to see the research that shows you protect this much area, we see this increase in fisheries outside of those areas, so there are positive knock-on effects. And if we stay only focused on the problems of the ocean, which are really important that we know about, but we need to go from that into this real rise in an area called solutions journalism that says we should be just as rigorously reporting on what's working, challenging it. In what ways does it work? Is it, Josh's good example, if clean air in LA, the things that have improved in LA, which has really happened since you were a kid, how did that happen? And are they applicable to other places that are dealing with air pollution issues, So just as rigorously looking at solutions as we look at problems, that's where we need to be heading. And in fact, that network is now, many, many countries, many news outlets that are starting to focus in the solutions way. And I think that's where we have to be going.
Man, that is a lot of really great information. I saw you co-created the hashtag Ocean Optimism in 2014, and that has had well over 100 million shares. So obviously people are talking about it. That optimistic message is getting out there. Where are some of the places that people listening to the podcast can go and do a little more research? Or, your website is Elin, that's ELIN, Kelsey, KELSEY.org. So I'm sure they can go there and learn a whole lot. And again, your book, Hope Matters, Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical for Solving the Environmental Crisis. What other resources do you have that people could go to and subscribe to or listen to in order to continue this optimistic, hopeful mindset of how they can have a positive impact on the environment?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So one place I would definitely go is just look up Solutions Journalism Network. It's a running thing. You can filter it by different issues that you care about and different parts of the world. You can do whatever you want to track stories that are emerging from many different countries. And they've more recently put in an education aspect to it. So teachers can look there for resources that are based in a solutions orientation. There's a a great program on BBC called People Fixing the World. You know, for those who like podcasts, I love listening to that one. I'm part of an international network that's putting together an existential toolkit for climate justice educators. And that'll be live next month. And that's a whole lot of resources around dealing with our emotions around the kinds of issues that we face and ways we can deal with those emotions in safe and supportive ways. And then hashtag Ocean Optimism. The Smithsonian Institute has started a whole hashtag Earth Optimism campaign. And so they have lots of resources. And what's great about those hashtags is you can look on a daily basis and see what's going on around. You know, we were talking about plastic bag bans. I just saw last week that Scotland has seen a 72% drop in beach plastic pollution of plastic bags since it imposed its 5 pence per bag tariff, you know, and now they're going up to 10 pence per bag because they've been able to see that it had a positive impact in terms of that. So there's those hashtags. And really, it can be as simple as if there's an issue you really care about, just Google searching and saying, you know, that issue, things moving in a good direction. That issue, solutions. That issue, successful outcomes. That issue, you know, just actively searching not the issue just by its name, but the additional, you know, evidence of positive momentum or any of those kinds of other keywords, and it'll start to place you in a different sense. And then I follow the GRIST, which gives you a weekly update on things happening in many parts of the world that are working a solutions way.
I love it. I love the work that you're doing. One of my biggest pet peeves, a lot of our employees at MWI know this, is that one of my biggest pet peeves is when somebody comes with a problem and within the same sentence, they don't at least give a possibility for a solution. You know, I can't stand just talking about problems. So I love this, and I'm excited to follow some of these hashtags, and we'll be sure to tag these when we, do the post for this episode and stuff. But it has been a pleasure to meet you and to get to know you and to see your ducks in the background and the beautiful backyard. And we really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. And we really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Corey. And thank you, Josh. It's wonderful to talk about it. And I really love that you're doing this from a social entrepreneurial standpoint. And I'd welcome your feedback on how to amplify this in that direction. That's really something I'm very interested in. So, okay, well,
let's stay in touch. Feel free to shoot me over an email. I'd love to talk, outside of this to see how we can collaborate and work together. That'd be great.
Thank you. That's great. All right. Take care, so both of you. Good luck with your talk tonight, Josh.
Thank you.
Family first. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Hello, it's Corey here, and I just want to thank you so much for listening into the Hope Strategy podcast. I hope you're enjoying it as much as we are enjoying having these amazing conversations with these incredible individuals talking about hope. We'd love it if you wouldn't mind liking, subscribing, and leaving us a review on iTunes or Spotify or anywhere that you listen to your podcasts, and share it with anybody you feel that can benefit from these messages of hope. Thank you so much for listening to the Hope Strategy podcast.